all of these men encountered God. And this encounter that they had with God, it changed their life. We have to begin to get an upward view of God. We see ourselves as insufficient, but this God has the ability to work in people like us to accomplish his plan. I want to welcome you back to the Man Up series. We're in session number 8, which is that we needed God's grace repeatedly. Of all the sessions that we have, I would venture to say that this session is the one that lands in my front yard the most. Just because when we started this Man Up series years ago, about 10 years ago, we used to call this that we had shortcomings that God had to overcome. Because it talks about the issue of every one of us have our issues one way or the other. When you look in the scriptures, really we see 2 types of shortcomings that every man has to deal with. The first is some insecurity that we have, or insecurities that the devil would use to try to keep us from serving the Lord Jesus Christ, or in a sense, fully surrendering. We see it early in the scriptures in the life of a guy by the name of Moses, and we talk normally about one of his issues, but honestly, he had really 3 or 4 objections as to why he didn't believe that he was the right guy to go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. He asked the question, first of all, he said, well, who am I, God, that I should go? The second issue that he brought up was, these folks aren't going to believe me. Why would they believe me? I mean, they say that Moses spent 40 years in Egypt thinking he was a somebody. He spent 40 years of his life in the wilderness learning that he was a nobody. And then he spent the last 40 years of his life learning what God could do in the life of somebody that was surrendered. And so we see in his life that he had issues. Who am I that I should go? He's going back to Egypt. I mean, last time he left there 40 years prior, he fled, and there was a possibility that he would be killed. And he fled out into the wilderness. So why would he be the right one to go back? And then he's like, they're not going to believe me. And then the third thing he said is, I'm not a good speaker. I'm slow of tongue. We see in the life of a guy named Jeremiah. Jeremiah's excuse was, he said, Lord, I'm a child. I'm too young to effectively be used. We see in the life of the guy by the name of Gideon, that Gideon said to the angel, he said, I'm from the least tribe in the least family and the least tribe of the nation of Israel. He's like, it's not me. And yet God looked at him, and God's view was, what he could be. And he said, you are a mighty man of valor. And when you think about that for just a minute, see, we look at ourselves and we see all of our shortcomings. I'm too young. I'm not a good speaker. Nobody's going to listen to me. I'm a nobody from nowhere is basically what Gideon was saying. And when we look at ourselves, we see, what we are, and sometimes we have a very low opinion of ourselves, and it's not bad to have a very humble opinion of ourselves. But when God looks at us, he looks at us as to what he knows we will become. That's why he said to Jeremiah, Jeremiah, don't say that you're a child. Before you were in your mother's womb, I ordained you to be a prophet unto the nations. When God looked at Gideon, and Gideon said, I'm a nobody from nowhere, God said to him, no, man, you are a mighty man of valor. And even when you move on through the scriptures, we see in the life of the Apostle Paul, his issue or shortcoming was some type of what he called a thorn in the flesh. Most people believe that was some type of an issue that he had with his eyesight. It probably was. But whatever that issue was, when he looked at it, he really felt like that if he was going to be able to do effective ministry for Jesus Christ, that thorn in the flesh needed to go away. In fact, he prayed, if you remember, 3 times to God, asking that thorn in the flesh would be taken away. And yet, God didn't take it away, did he? And Jesus said to him, he said, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. And so Paul then had a change of attitude, and he learned how to work through, realize that Jesus could fill his gaps, that even though you and I, if you would even take me, I can look at my life and myself, and I see all my shortcomings and I see all my inabilities. But what I do know is this, is that God will equip me. The old saying is, God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called, that he'll give you what you need to be successful in his ministry. And so sometimes what holds us back from serving the Lord is that we look at ourselves and we go, I'm too young, I'm too old, God wouldn't use me because I'm not talented enough, gifted enough. And yet the answer to God in almost every one of those circumstances was something like this: I will be with you. I will be with you. And that was a common theme that we see as God spoke to these gentlemen. And he would say, you just need to go because I will be with you. As if the presence and the power of God was enough for us to be successful despite our shortcomings. And actually, it is. Because God's not dependent upon our strengths. In fact, Paul understood by the time Jesus finished working in his heart that it was in our weakness, in fact, that we are strong. The other kind of shortcoming that we see in the Bible that God had to deal with, sometimes it's an issue of a guy needs to be built up to be able to go do the work of God. And sometimes we see a guy that needs to be humbled down, like Peter, for example, who said, Lord, I'll never deny you. And he was so confident. And it's like, I'll die before I deny you. And Jesus is like, Peter, before the cock crows, you are going to deny me 3 times. And Peter just so much insisted that, there was no way that he was going to deny the Lord. And that pride and that self-sufficiency that Peter had, just quite frankly, that needed to go away, because God doesn't work through, in a sense, the proud believer, but he rather works through the humble. God's plan is that humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. And he said, and then I'll exalt you in due time. And so sometimes what we see in the lives of believers is that they need to be humbled. Nebuchadnezzar, he never was going to become a believer and be what he needed to be until he went through that period of 7 years in his life that humbled him. And then he became a believer and became a servant of God. And we have one of the great statements in the Old Testament about God given from a guy that most of his life he was an unbeliever. And so as we close this session out, I just want to leave you with a couple of statements. Rick Perry said this, that the God we serve does not seek out the perfect, but instead he uses our imperfections and our shortcomings for his greater good. And then he went on to say, I'm humbled by my own limitations. And I think most all of us are, because most all of us are from the category that the devil reminds us of why we couldn't, or tells us why we couldn't. And so for most of us, we're like Rick Perry, that we're humbled by our limitations, but then he said, where I am weak, he or God is strong. Leonard Ravenhill had probably the best statement on this topic when he said, today God is bypassing men, not because they are too ignorant, but because they are too self-sufficient. Brethren, he says, our abilities are our handicaps. Now you think about that. Our abilities are our handicaps, and our talents, Ravenhill writes, are our stumbling blocks. It's clear, though, that every man that God used in a great way in the Bible had some kind of a shortcoming. In fact, we had a session that we've taken out, and I just want to include it very briefly here, that we would say all those men, they messed up, but they still stood up. And in your life, maybe the shortcoming that you have that's holding you up is the devil's reminding you of something you did in the past, like David. And every one of us have a shortcoming. It can be an inability. It can be our arrogance and our pride that needs to be checked up. Maybe it's something you did in the past that the devil keeps hanging over your head to say that God couldn't. But what I'm here to tell you is that with God, all things are possible. And if you're willing to just surrender yourself to the Lord, which we'll talk more in the next session about, but if you're willing to just surrender and have the faith to believe that God could use you and work in you and through you, it'll amaze you what God can do. And so I ask you this very simple question. Do you have shortcomings that God has to overcome? And if you do you have the faith to believe that God will?